Week 4 is come and gone, but after a battle with COVID, Jake Tribbey is back for this week 5 here on the DFS Early Look. It's been an afternoon, but we're here and we're ready to roll to give you the earliest look at the DFS slate.
Yeah, so Anthony Richardson, I'm sure everyone is tired, hearing me talk about Anthony Richardson week after week after week. But even at 7,000 on DraftKings, he's still too cheap. He's averaging 30.3 fantasy points per 4 quarters, which is 2.6 fantasy points per game, better than the greatest fantasy quarterback season of all time. And it's 6.4 fantasy points per game, better than the current QB1, which is Justin Herbert. Basically, if Anthony Richardson had been fully healthy all year, he would be destroying fantasy football right now. He's also the greatest athlete to ever play professional quarterback. And he's averaging 2.6 rush attempts per quarter of play. That's roughly on par with Jalen Hurts last year, who had the second most QB rush attempts of any quarterback ever in just 15 games. Now, the matchup with Tennessee might not seem great on paper. Tennessee only allowing 2.9 yards per carry, easily the league's toughest run defense right now. But that's going to force Anthony Richardson to drop back even more than usual. And Anthony Richardson is averaging 0.8 fantasy points per dropback, which is easily the highest number we've seen over at least the last 3 seasons. I have a hard time seeing Richardson being anything other than the top value quarterback this week. He should be super popular, and deservedly so. He's really good, and he's crushing in terms of fantasy football output right now.
He's unreal, and he's about to get a boost, of course, with the news of Jonathan Taylor being activated. We're going to take a quick second. We come back. We're going to pull the board up because what we like to do is make sure everyone can see the values being discussed because we're cool like that. Sit tight. Look, if you look at what Jake is telling you for the value, obviously we know Tua's elite. Lamar gets a Pittsburgh defense that got shellacked. It was insane how that game went. You really look down the rest of the board with Goff and Burrow, and Stroud is unbelievable, but that true number 1 on the week overall upside, it's definitely with Richardson, especially when you look at the rest of the board.
Yeah, absolutely with you there. Stroud is really interesting at 6,000. I imagine he'll gain a ton of steam this week, and you can always justify any of these higher price quarterbacks, or of course, Kirk Cousins against the Kansas City Chiefs. But really, to me, quarterback just starts and ends with Anthony Richardson. Beyond him, I don't see a ton of great, floor ceiling combo players. At the end of the day, Richardson's just $1,000 too cheap on DraftKings. He'll be 8K by the end of October, and that's a discount that I plan on taking advantage of until he is the same price as Jalen Hurts.
Right, because he realistically he should be. It just I think this. You look at their points per game. He's leading that group. It's insane. We're gonna have a look at running back, and of course the superstar himself. Everything else looks really sad in Atlanta, but Bijan Robinson does not look sad. He is an absolute standout. Gets a tough run defense. There's a couple the catches he made in that game last week were just out of this world insane.
Yeah, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Bijan Robinson is the most talented running back in the NFL right now, and he's really the only thing to like about this Atlanta offense. His raw usage hasn't been incredible. He's only sitting at 16 expected fantasy points per game, which is RB14 right now, but he still hit a 73% snap share and earned at least 16 opportunities in each of his last 3 contests. And again, he's really the only positive thing on offense that Atlanta has going. He's also easily one of the most efficient runners with the ball in his hands so far, and he still hasn't had a huge game. Now he draws a Houston defense that's allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, a year after ranking as the league's single softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing running backs. I think if you're just looking at expected fantasy points per game, Robinson won't really pop for you. But everything beyond that, he jumps out to me as a really strong play, especially on a slate where we have very limited options above 7K. Saquon may not play. Derrick Henry has not been tremendously efficient this year. Granted, he did have a good game last week. And that, to me, kind of leaves Bijan as the clear premier pay-up option at the position.
I honestly don't have an argument against him as the elite pay up option. You can't rely on David Montgomery coming out and doing what he did. Joe Mixon has been shaky at best. Kamara's output, insane. We're going to talk about him in a minute, but I know the HN team is really wanting to cook him up. It's been very touchdown heavy for his fantasy production once again, and chasing those touchdowns will help you, but doing it every week, I mean, it's tough to fit him into the lineup this week with these other options that you do have down. Speaking of other options that you have, Kyren Williams, 6,700 on DraftKings, 7,800 over on Fanduel. I mean, forget what you think about Kyren Williams as a football player, where it came out of the draft, right? He was too slow. He's not there. It doesn't matter. The dude is the bell cow this year. It is crazy what he's doing.
Yeah, that's true. I believe Scott Barrett described Kyren Williams as laughably unathletic, but that doesn't matter when his usage is very similar to 2017, 2018 Todd Gurley. So he's top 3 in among all running backs among snap share, targets per game, and expected fantasy points per game. The 19.8 expected fantasy points per game that Kyren Williams is seeing is right there with 2017, 2018 Todd Gurley, who earned 20.2 expected fantasy points per game. Now, sure, obviously, Kyren Williams is not the same player as peak Todd Gurley, but Todd Gurley, his average salary in 2017, 2018 was 8,700. Even if you say, half of that was driven by efficiency, the reality is we're getting a guy who's seeing 2017, 2018 Todd Gurley usage at 6,700. That's $2,000 cheaper than peak Todd Gurley was for 2 straight seasons. So again, I understand, hating on Kyren Williams a bit due to efficiency or his lack of athleticism. The matchup isn't great against Philadelphia, but at the same time, he's seeing the volume to make up for it, and volume's king at running back. So everything else kind of doesn't matter when he's still egregiously underpriced relative to his current usage.
I know we talked about when we did this a couple of weeks ago, taking out Dynasty Brain. Kyren Williams is the example of removing Dynasty Brain in DFS and why it's so important. You might have passed on him because of how you play in your other leagues, but if you're a DFS main, this is the type of player you need to fit in your lineup, and he's still incredibly cheap. You mentioned him earlier.
I would imagine he ends up as the clear cash game running back this week. I mean, he was last week, ridiculously high owned, had a great game, and they only increased his price by 700. So, it's pretty simple with Kyren Williams, at least in regards to calling him a value.
Right. Yeah, like you mentioned, it's Todd Gurley. If you don't remember Todd Gurley's output, it's prime Saquon Barkley, significantly cheaper. It's disgusting what he's doing. Alvin Kamara came back, and boy, did he ever come back. I don't remember a running back having this target share just walking in, but I think it showed the state of the running back room in New Orleans, and that Carr shoulder was way worse than they let on. You think that continues? You have him here as a value, 6,300 on DraftKings, 7,100 on FanDuel, still very cheap in a tough matchup. Do we see a repeat performance?
Yeah, when I wrote up Alvin Kamara last week, I was optimistic that he would see an elite workload combined with his previous efficiency and his peak seasons. Alvin Kamara was always one of the most efficient running backs of all time. Now the efficiency didn't come last week, and I'm not sure it will, but the workload was incredible. 75% snap share, 25.9 expected fantasy points per game. That's the second best usage by any running back last week. And an absurd 14 targets, which is the 16th most by a running back since 2010. Again, he didn't pop in terms of efficiency, only forced 2 tackles, but volume is king at the running back position, much like Kyren Williams. Kamara's 35% of team expected fantasy points last week was the 3rd highest mark by a running back this year. Now, New England is a slightly positive matchup for opposing running backs, but they aren't a strong enough matchup to just play Kamara based on the matchup. That said, they do run man coverage at the league's highest rate, and Derek Carr has checked the ball down against man coverage at the league's 2nd highest rate this season. Now, at first, when I saw that stat, I thought, oh, well, that's only because of what he did in week 4. Well, even if you exclude week 4, Derek Carr still checks the ball down at a top 3 rate against man coverage. And that means a lot of targets for Alvin Kamara. Even if you think he's washed, which maybe he is, I mean, the potential for 10 targets at 6,300 is one that you really can't pass up. He's not quite as strong of a value as a guy like Kyren Williams, who has a much stronger guaranteed workload and all game scripts and, won't be as reliant on checkdowns. But man, it's hard not to consider him a strong value when, like I said, he's only 6,300.
The play that you saw from Kamara last week is what you've been paying up for with Jahmyr Gibbs for the first couple weeks of the season. Now you have it. It's just in Alvin Kamara, who is for now barely more expensive than the previously mentioned Jahmyr Gibbs. You should be 100% cashing in because his price, it will go up.
As long as he keeps seeing 14 targets a game, his price is going to go up. And I think the shoulder injury too with Carr is a big factor where maybe for these next 2 or 3 weeks we see Alvin Kamara as a much bigger part of the game plan if they want to hide Carr from throwing downfield a little bit.
Yeah, giving Kamara a couple weeks off to start the year was just absolute money. Speaking of money, Tyreek Hill. He's up there in price, 9,000 on DraftKings, 9,400. He's the wide receiver one over there on Fanduel, coming down what we call a down week for Tyreek Hill, but he gets, he absolutely gets a smash matchup against the Giants. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so there's a pair of Dolphins I want to talk about on this slate. Obviously starts and ends with Tyreek Hill, though. So something that I think is pretty interesting is that since joining the Dolphins, Tyreek Hill averages just 13.3 DraftKings fantasy points per game against divisional opponents. Outside of the division, though, he averages 28.9 DraftKings fantasy points per game. He scored over 30 DraftKings points in 50% of his non-division games. Now, you could say, Jake, that's a fluky split. You're just pulling something that looks good for the sake of an article. But I'm not necessarily sure that it is. Miami's divisional opponents spend the most time out of any team in the NFL figuring out how to stop Tyreek Hill. And so far, they've been successful. But the New York Giants, Tyreek Hill's week 5 opponent, they haven't figured out how to stop anybody. They're allowing the 7th most yards per attempt this season, and they're also blitzing and running man coverage at top 3 rates. And I think that's very important because Tyreek Hill has ranked top 4 in yards per out run against the blitz and against man coverage of 131 qualifiers. This is arguably the perfect matchup for Hill, who, like I said, crushes man coverage, crushes the blitz. And yeah, he's 9,000, which of course is expensive, but it's also Tyreek Hill. Hard to think of a player who could hit 50 points as easily as Tyreek Hill.
Right, when you're paying up for a player like that, he's anchoring your room. He's the one that's going to keep you up on the leaderboards. You need an anchor, and if you're going to anchor someone, this is, as Jake said, is the matchup. It almost couldn't be lined up better for an absolute monster game. Marquise Brown, who he just keeps producing. I mean, shout out Josh Dobbs, who the last couple of weeks has just gone out there and been Himothy. He's unreal right now, playing out of his mind. With that, Marquise Brown gets a bump, 5,000 on DraftKings, 6,400 on FanDuel right now. And if you look at the players around him, I mean, Michael Thomas, Tank Dell, Jordan Addison had 1 target last week, and he's priced above Marquise Brown this week. This just screams like a good matchup.
Yeah, Marquise Brown is popping as a really clear value, but I did want to talk about Devon Achane real quick before we jump to Brown, if only because, first of all, Devon Achane at 6,000. My hope, and keep in mind, still early, guys, but my hope is that him being priced up is going to negate heavy ownership here. I mean, he was still pretty low owned last week, and again, I remain optimistic that he will be in week 5. Really, he's just the most efficient running back in the NFL, and he had a 66% snap share and 61% route share last week. That's a notable improvement over his numbers in week 3. At the same time, though, it was a blowout, and a lot of that usage came in the second half. So I just wanted to note Devon Achane really quick as a player who, if he's high owned, I think I'm going to be totally off of him. But if he's sub 10%, he jumps out as a really strong running back play. But getting back over to wide receiver, Marquise Brown is one of the best usage-based values on the slate, and it really isn't even close. He's averaging the 8th most expected fantasy points per game among slate-eligible wide receivers, yet he's priced as the wide receiver 23 on DraftKings and the wide receiver 17 on Fanduel. Really, the analysis can just end there, but the Bengals are also a pretty solid matchup. They've allowed the 2nd most yards per reception and the 8th highest yards per out run to opposing pass catchers. You could argue, because they haven't allowed a significant target share to outside receivers, that they could lower Brown's volume slightly, but that's not an argument that I think holds a ton of weight, mostly just because Brown's main target competition is a 32-year-old tight end who can't do anything after the catch. Marquise Brown should be at least $800 higher. He is going to be one of the strongest values of the slate in week 5.
And I think his ownership is probably going to drop a little bit given the pass rushing ability of Cincinnati. I can't imagine people are going to just keep believing that Dobbs plays out of his mind. So
yeah,
the perception hurt him.
Quarterback play is a notable concern, and we have another Arizona Cardinal that we'll talk about later in Zach Ertz. Both of those guys are going to project pretty much every week until they get significant price increases as strong values. But at the same time, Josh Dobbs has impressed. The Arizona Cardinals have impressed. I think he's better than how good we assumed he'd be heading into the season, and he's throwing downfield, which is important. I know going into the season, Scott Barrett was always harping on Josh Dobbs doesn't throw downfield. Marquise Brown is total dust with him at quarterback. That ended up not being entirely true. Really, though, we're kind of hoping Marquise Brown just holds a suppressed price until Kyler comes back so that we can hit on that stack, hopefully in a few weeks. But even for now, Marquise Brown, still a strong value.
Unbelievable value. Speaking of unbelievable values, the weekly Houston Texans wide receiver this week is one we haven't discussed yet. It is, of course, the old wily veteran, Robert Woods, a meager 4,000 on DraftKings, 5,000 on FanDuel. That's wide receiver 38 and 53 respectively. Let's talk about Robert Woods.
Yeah, so Robert Woods, I have a hard time not thinking that he will be the top value at pretty much any position over at FanDuel. A wide receiver 53 price tag is just ridiculous. Really, though, you can make an argument for any of these big 3 Texans wide receivers as strong values, given that they're all still cheap. And CJ Stroud is absolutely slinging the ball. But to me this week, Robert Woods really jumped out. 4,000 is way too cheap. He's earned the 2nd best usage among Houston pass catchers, actually ahead of Tank Dell. And despite the size difference between Woods and Dell, it's actually Woods who leads the team in both slot routes and slot targets. He almost has 3 times as many slot targets as Tank Dell. And that really plays into the matchup against Atlanta this week. The Falcons have allowed the league's 3rd highest slot target rate and the 9th most receiving yards to opposing slot players. They also run man coverage at the league's 10th highest rate. Woods, on top of being the team's primary slot threat, has also logged the 2nd most targets, twice as many as Tank Dell, against man coverage. So again, all these Houston wide receivers will probably be varying degrees of popular. I would imagine Nico Collins is going to be chalk. Tank Dell will be around 10 or 12%. And then you'll probably get Robert Woods in the single digits, which I don't necessarily think is correct, given that he's seen great usage and the matchup mostly plays into his abilities.
He's just been everything they need in that wide receiver room, holding it together. But you're right. It could be any one of the Texans wide receivers. Nico Collins balling out, Tank Dell balling out, Robert Woods, dog. Just unbelievable play coming from Houston. I don't know how long CJ Stroud is going to keep this up. Maybe he just breaks every rookie record imaginable. I hope he does. But he's doing it with no offensive line either. So I'm holding out hopes for a strong Houston game, especially against Atlanta. I think you're right. Robert Woods is going to be the best deal out there. We should be looking for him in the lineups. Look, tight end, sometimes it can be quirky. Sometimes it can be a little weird. Don't have to try very hard with this one. Mr. Taylor Swift himself gets the Minnesota Vikings. 7,600. He's another anchor type player. I don't even think he's a player you have to stack either. I think Kelce can get you there just on his own. Let's talk Travis Kelce with this juicy matchup.
Yeah, so we know that Travis Kelce is always a great tournament option. I mean, he's the best fantasy tight end of all time, but he's an even better tournament option when he's playing in the highest total game of the slate. This Kansas City Minnesota game, 52.5 total, easily the highest of the slate by, I believe, 2.5 points. So over the last 3 seasons, Kelce in all games has averaged 18.2 DraftKings fantasy points per game. But that jumps to 22.8 DraftKings fantasy points per game in games with a total of 50 or higher. In other words, the greatest fantasy tight end of all time is 25% better in high total games like the one he's playing in this week. And Minnesota looks like a bottom 10 pass defense. They've allowed the 5th highest yards per route run, 6th most yards after the catch, and 3rd most receptions to opposing pass catchers this year. We got to imagine Kansas City is going to feed Travis Kelce. And at 7,600, he's actually the 4th cheapest he's been since week 1 of 2022. So this is a slight discount that you're getting on a guy who, we probably want to play every week anyway.
Yeah, I can't imagine just deciding just openly to not play Travis Kelce. It's like this matchup. The top 2 tight ends, really, Kelce and Hawkinson, are just going to be big time players. Ownership is going to be massive, but again, he's not a player you really want to sit out on. If Travis Kelce is not for you for some reason, we have a second option, and it might sound gross. Jake referenced him a little earlier. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago, but Zach Ertz is still doing his thing, even if it looks real slow. Slow motion Zach Ertz might be the new phrase, but 3,500 on DraftKings, 5,100 on Fanduel, tight end 11 for both. Again, we talked about Marquise Brown against Cincinnati. Let's talk about Zach Ertz.
Yeah, so Ertz is 4th in route share, 2nd in targets, 3rd in air yard share, and 2nd in expected fantasy points per game among tight ends. Obviously, that makes his $3,500 DraftKings price tag look like a bit of a joke. At the same time, though, he's been insanely inefficient, averaging just 8.4 fantasy points per game. Even that ranks 7th best among slate eligible tight ends. So even tremendously inefficient Zach Ertz is still presenting value based on his production relative to the other tight ends on this slate. Now, at the same time, 10 targets for Zach Ertz is probably worth, as many as 5 or 6 targets for some of these other tight ends. But you can't deny that he's the top usage-based DFS value of the week, and it's not really close. And he draws a strong matchup against a Bengals defense that's allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. I think if Zach Ertz is going to project as a strong value, I can't imagine he'll be the highest owned tight end this week, just given how inefficient he's been. But if he does project for heavy ownership, I think it makes a ton of sense to want to get away from him for some of these other, much lower floor, but probably similar ceiling options. Kyle Pitts at 3,300 is always interesting. Chigo Konkwu at 3,200 is always interesting. A lot of guys on this list that objectively probably have more upside than Ertz. But at the same time, if you're just looking for, 7, 8, 9 points out of your tight end, which if you're paying 3,000, you probably are, Zach Ertz isn't a bad option, as much as I hate talking about him every week.
It feels that way because once again, they have another tight end on that team that just more explosive in every way. But here's Zach Ertz reliving his old Philadelphia Eagles days again. And it's just a cheap option. Look, I know a couple weeks ago it wasn't pretty against Dallas. Have more faith. Zach Ertz, even with that game, is still putting up these kind of numbers on the season. He's here to stay, whether we want to believe it or not. A lot of great options out there for DFS. We'll be right back with some final thoughts before we get out of here. Jake, phenomenal. I'm ready to go. Let the people know when the article drops in case they want to go and read it and what else we have for the DFS slate.
Yeah, so the DFS Early Look will be out tomorrow, should be posted by noon. And then we will also have later this week, we'll have DFS Study Hall up Thursday morning. We'll have DFS Values up Friday morning. We'll have Scott's big slate breakdown up Saturday morning. And of course, we'll have the best DFS show in the world, Cashing Points, at 7 p.m. on Friday. We'll be a normal show again. Scott Barrett is back from his Mexico wedding. I am finally starting to get healthy from COVID. And of course, we'll have the great Graham Barfield. Always a fantastic host over with cashing points. So yeah, don't sleep on any of our DFS content. I'm sure we'll have many more Millie Maker winners coming among our subs. We had Neil Ragland win 20K last week. So a lot of great stuff coming, and I'm excited for another great week.
That's right. Get your DFS content here. If you're watching the video and you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below. Let us know what your favorite play is on this here DFS slate. We'll be right back with you next week for, again, the industry leader, an early look for DFS content. Good night, everybody.